What is anti-Semitism? Is it a psychosis where people are hallucinating and imagining things that simply aren't happening at all? Is anti-Semitism a skewed reading of reality? So there are some facts out there, but then you read them in the most sinister way possible. Or is it based on things that Jews are actually doing that might be problematic, and then extrapolating that to blame all Jews everywhere at all times? You can find examples of all three in the history of anti-Semitism. For example, in medieval times, Jews were accused of kidnapping Christian children and torturing them and extracting their blood to make matzah. It never happened. It was a psychosis, a hallucination, imagining that it did. For the second example, a skewed reading of reality, think about all those global Jewish conspiracies who imagine that Jews are behind communism and capitalism, and Jews are selling arms to both sides in every war. And those conspiracy theories are, there are wars happening and someone's selling weaponry, but assuming that it's Jews doing all of it, that's a little askew. Or a response to things Jews do, you hear people who are resentful of Jewish success. But if you look at the surveys, Jews do have a higher average income and a mean income or median income, whatever the sort of typical income is, than the average American. They have higher levels of academic achievement than the average American. When they say Jews control Hollywood, demographically, it's not that far off. Now, there's a difference between Jews control Hollywood and the Jews control Hollywood. Do you hear the difference? One might be, sociology, and the other is conspiracy. So part of our challenge is to tease out what anti-Semitism is if we want to respond to it, because if it's a psychosis of hallucination, there's not much we can do. But if it's a skewed reading of reality or a twisted response to things that are actually happening, maybe there's a way to respond that will increase education and appreciation rather than hatred. This is a survey based on similar questions that the Anti-Defamation League has asked since 1964. And they're trying to find out how many people agree with several of these statements. Just agreeing with one, according to the ADL, isn't enough. And as you can see, some of these, you might even agree with a couple of them, and you certainly might not always see them as negative. For example, the one that got the most responses of people agreeing that it was somewhat true or mostly true was the statement, Jews stick together more than other Americans. Well, you might feel that that's a good thing to stick together as a group. Sometimes people admire the Korean communities that support each other's businesses. Or there's an African-American company called Buy Us For Us. And the idea is that it's a support your own community. So maybe Jews sticking together is a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, it could also be a bad thing. Now, others of these statements are less ambiguous. Jews in business go out of their way to hire other Jews. Jews are more loyal to Israel than America. Jews always like to be at the head of things. Jews have too much power in the business world. Jews have too much control and influence on Wall Street. Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. Jews are more willing to use shady practices to get what they want. They have too much power in the United States. They have a lot of irritating faults. Now, whatever you think about Jews that you personally know that might have irritating faults, this is again a claim of the broad population. Jews are not as honest and so on. So the way that the ADL has counted these in the past was to say if you had yes to 6 or more of these questions, then you counted as sort of the hardcore anti-Semitic population. If you said yes to 2 or 3, maybe you were sort of in the middle, persuadable. If you only said 0 or 1, then you're free to go. Now, what's interesting about this survey report in 2023, based on a survey done in 2022, they highlighted the fact that a large number said yes to one of them, which is contrary to their own methodology, where they said one doesn't count by itself. It has to be in the constellation. So they were getting a little bit inflammatory in their report. But there were some details that were definitely problematic. So here again is demonstrating that only 15% said zero, got zero correct. So they read that as, look, you've got 85% believing at least one of these to be true. Well, but if you say one or zero doesn't really matter that much in isolation, now you've got 40% who said zero and 60% who said more than one. If you just add up the 0, 1, or 2, now you've got 56% and only 44% believing 3 or more. So you have to, parse out how you want to read the data. But even counting that 6 or more tropes, it's gone up in the last 3 years, where it had been in 1964 as high as 29%. It was down to 20% by 92. And then it languished in the teens and low teens, even in the single digits by 2014, until 2022, between economic dislocation, conflict with Israel, a disconnect between Israel and younger generations, in part because of the abiding presence of Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing coalitions in Israel, the lack of progress on any kind of peace process, and so on. Well, that number has gone up quite a bit. And of course, social conflict, economic dislocation, that makes a big difference for anti-Semitic attitudes increasing as well. And so with that number going up from 11% to 20%, that makes us nervous because we see that there's a greater number of people who are expressing these anti-Semitic attitudes and who are agreeing with 6 or more of these kind of statements. And someone who agrees with 6 or more of these statements is not someone I want to meet in a dark alley. This past week, we observed Holocaust Memorial Day, based on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945, almost 80 years ago. It'll be 80 years next year. And it's entirely reasonable to be sensitive or cautious when it comes to anti-Jewish hatred, given that history. There's that famous saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. We don't want to get into a rhyming period in our own experience. So I want to give you a brief history of anti-Semitism as a phenomenon, and then we'll talk about what's happening today and some of the challenges that we're facing. Now, there are stories about people not liking Judeans or Jews that go back centuries. Think about the Purim story. It's set in Persia during the Babylonian exile, or the time that Jews were living in the eastern, what we say today, diaspora, in the city of Susa, which is one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. Now, it was probably written in the first couple centuries BCE, so between 200 and the year 0, probably earlier than the year 0, but it's set in this setting, and it describes a minister of the king whose name is Haman, who has a run-in with a Jew who refuses to bow down to him, and then he decides that he hates all Jews and wants to kill them all. Now, he's never heard of Hitler. He doesn't know about race. But the idea that you meet one Jew, you have a bad encounter, and you hate all Jews and you want to kill them all, that sort of passes the bar in my measure of anti-Semitism. And you find other examples of this that come out during the Greco-Roman period, again, from the last couple centuries BCE to the first few centuries of the Common Era. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote a book near the end of the first century of the Common Era called Contra Apionem, or Against Apion. Apion was a Greek writer who lived in Alexandria, and he, along with another Egyptian writer named Manetho, had written a number of books and statements about Jews that were very negative. They claimed that Jews actually kept non-Jews captive to sacrifice them at a certain point, that when they were expelled from Egypt, it's because they were infected with a terrible disease that made them stink, and that's why the Egyptians kicked them out, and other kinds of slanders against the Jews. And so what Josephus wrote was a rebuttal. He wrote the answers to these scurrilous statements against the Jews. We don't actually have Apion's original work, or Manetho's work for that matter, but we do have Josephus's rebuttal to what they had to say. And so we can deduce what the accusations were based on what he's responding to. But clearly, these were serious concerns. Jews were sometimes accused of being bad citizens in the Greco-Roman world because they refused to sacrifice to the city gods. To be a good citizen, you paid your taxes, you obeyed the laws, and one of the laws was periodically you sacrificed to the emperor, to the city gods. Well, Jews wouldn't do that. and say that, so they were accused of being untrustworthy. They were even accused of being atheists because they didn't have a statue of their God. So what kind of God could they have if there's no statue? So this goes back to long before Christianity, a sense that Jews were suspicious, Jews were different, Jews self-isolated, the projection of not liking Jews because the claim is the Jews don't like us. We still even hear that today. And so this dates back to before Christianity even appeared. Now, with the arrival of Christianity, particularly with the establishment of Christianity as the formal religion of the Roman Empire, both in its Catholic version in the West and its Orthodox or Greek Orthodox version in the East, Jews are in for a much worse time because the church sees itself as having superseded, as having replaced the Jews. You know, Jesus comes to the Jews first, and what do? They don't accept him. Some of them do. Those become the apostles and the early church. But the ones that reject him are the ones that are seen as being blind, even sinister. There's a famous iconography that you can see at some medieval churches where on one side you have ecclesia, which is the church, and on the other side of the entrance you have synagoga, which is the synagogue. And the synagogue is depicted as with a broken staff and blindfolded because the Jews were blind. They didn't see and recognize who Jesus was, and therefore they deserve whatever happens to them. Now, there was an approach that did allow Jews to survive. It was the idea that Jews are a witness to the time of Christ, and therefore they should be kept around, but not so successful. You know, an object lesson. Here's what happens if you don't accept the Christian hegemony and follow that religion. You'll turn out like those people next door who are living so miserably. You know, Judaism became almost the antithesis of Christianity. So if the priests got mad at the ruling powers, the dukes and earls and lords, they might say that they're Judaizing. They're being corrupted by the Jewish moneylenders. That being Jewish was like the universal epithet that you could apply for being not Christian. It was the opposite. It was the antithesis. And gradually it becomes associated with the devil. Remember, you've got God and Jesus on one side, and you have an active concept of a devil who's the evil, who undermines, who works against and countermands the divine plan. Well, if you are defining yourself as the anti-Jew and you're anti-devil, then maybe the Jew and the devil are on the same team. And so Jews begin to do things in the Christian imagination that seem almost demonic. Here's a depiction of a blood libel image from the Nuremberg Chronicle printed in 1493. And I know that's a little pixelated, so it may be hard to see exactly, but what you see here is a depiction of a Jewish community. And you can know this in part because of the beards. Also, you'll notice the man on the left has this hat with a little almost bell on it that was typical of what Jews were required to wear at the time, or the yellow marker on their sleeve that wasn't invented by Nazis. That also dates back to this period. And what do you see them doing here? You see them attacking a child who's blonde, who's innocent. And what are they doing? They are both circumcising the child. You can see someone attacking the genitals there. And they are also extracting blood. The blood is being collected in a bowl. And the accusation is that they would then use that to make their matzah. You'll notice the depiction of the child. What does he remind you of? Looks like the crucifixion, right? The innocent suffering of Jesus is now reenacted in this suffering of the Christian child. Even the stigmata are in similar places where Jesus is stabbed, you know, in the torso and so on. Now, why would you accuse the Jews of putting blood in their matzah, where if you read any rabbinic law, they have an anathema, a hatred of blood in food? You have to even break an egg into a bowl to make sure there's not a blood spot before you put it in something you're baking. And the method of kosher slaughter is to drain as much blood as possible from the animal while you're killing them. Well, you see, this is the projection of the Jew as devil or as ally of the devil, because Christians have a version of an unleavened bread like matzah. It's called the communion wafer, right? So the Jewish version is the devil wafer. what happens during the communion? The wafer and the wine become the body and the blood, right? That's the transubstantiation idea. Well, the Jews are doing something similar. They're attacking the body, they're attacking the blood, but in an evil direction, not in the holy direction of the church. It's a projection of Christian ideas. And the same is shown in the accusation that Jews would desecrate the host. Now, this doesn't mean that they're bad guests when they come over for dinner. Desecrating the host means the holy host, the wafer that Jews would steal and then attack, just like they attacked the body of Jesus way back when, so too here. And you can see they've stolen a box in the upper left and the upper right. You see what that man is doing? He's taking a knife and he's stabbing the wafer, and what's coming out of it? It's blood that's coming out from the wafer. And then in the left, they've caught and arrested the Jews in the bottom left, and on the right, they're torturing them to get them to confess to what they've done. Again, you can see the hat with the little bell on top, indicating that they're clearly Jewish. That's the result of the accusation. Now, we, in a modern pluralistic perspective, would say, what are they thinking? Why would they think that Jews would steal the host? Because Jews don't believe that that's the body of Christ. But the point of this artwork and this accusation, you see, it's not that the Jews don't believe it's the body. Everyone knows it's the body. That's the facts. That's truth. The Jews are evil in that they refuse to accept the truth, or they're going to use the truth to get back at God one more time. So you can see how this accusation, which actually comes out during the time there's some dispute over whether the wafer actually turns into the body or not, is saying even the Jews know this becomes the body. Look what they do to it. So again, you're using the Jews to make an argument within Christianity, but you're also accusing the Jews of being evil, being in league with the devil, doing terrible things. And so then the steps from the accusation to the expulsions that took place in many European countries between 1290 and 1490, more or less, makes sense, because the Jews, if they're if they're this evil, then they shouldn't be here. That's why Jews tended to migrate to the east and wound up in Eastern Europe, actually, as a result of the Western European persecutions. We have, beginning in the Spanish Inquisition period, from 1390 going forward, a concept called limpieza de sangre. And this begins to sound familiar too. The idea was that Jews were converting to Christianity, but some of them maintained a secret Jewish practice. So all the new Christians were suspect. Old Christians were fine, but if you were a new Christian, you were suspect. And so you sometimes had to prove your limpieza de sangre, your purity of blood, to get access to church hierarchy or a governmental success and so on. Now, this begins to sound almost like a racialist anti-Semitism, where before it was anti-Judaism, but once you converted, you were done. You were purified, right? You had your baptism, which purifies you of sin. You accept Jesus and his practice as what you're going to follow. You join the church. You leave behind a Jewish community. But if you start asking, who are your parents and how recently were you converted and are you really a Christian, now it becomes a kind of racialist or ethnic anti-Semitism that's attacking Jews for their heritage, not just for their beliefs or their ritual practices and their opposition to Christianity. So you begin to have, again, leaders that push Jews out. Martin Luther, for example, during the Reformation period was very anti-Jewish. Initially, he was supportive of them. He said, oh, they didn't get caught up in the Catholic Church excesses. But then when they rejected him, he got even madder. Same thing happened with Muhammad, by the way, in Islam as well. In the Muslim world, you did have some anti-Jewish sentiment, but again, it wasn't a racialist anti-Semitism. If Jews converted to Islam, they were in, they were done. And there was also a tradition of toleration, where Jews were understood to have some kind of revealed revelation, albeit an older version. You know, if the Torah is Revelation 1.0 and the New Testament is Revelation 2.0, then the Quran is Revelation 3.0 and 3 point last. Like, it's the seal of the prophecy. It's the end of Revelation. It's the best version, so don't rely on 1.0 or 2.0, rely only on 3.0, would say the Islamic empires. However, the fact that the Jews got 1.0 deserves some protection and some toleration. Jews were able to practice their religion as they chose. They were able to live where they chose. They could move between different Arab ruled countries in the Islamic empires. They could choose what professions they wanted. They even became physicians, doctors, viziers, court officials in Islamic courts. They were very successful in the Islamic world as long as they accepted a subordinate status. In Arabic, the term is dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. In English, it's a tolerated minority where you have to accept that you can't build your synagogue too high, you can't blow your shofar or ring your church bells too loud, because Christians were also in the dhimmi category. In some places, you had to wear distinguishing clothing, or you couldn't ride your horse in town, you couldn't wear a sword in public. You had to accept a subordinate status. And as long as you didn't become uppity, you would be fine. But sometimes the Muslim rulers would decide the Jews were getting too uppity, and there would be some kind of a equivalent of a pogrom that would attack Jewish communities. But for most of the Islamic period until modern times, Jews lived in large numbers in the Middle East, all through North Africa, and in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and they were simply part of the landscape. They were accepted as normal participants in the society that had distinct customs. For example, they could drink wine, where Muslims were not allowed to drink wine. Now, Jews shouldn't sell wine to Muslims, because then that's encouraging them to sin. And Jews were not allowed to convert Muslims into Judaism. Jews could convert out, but Muslims couldn't convert in. And Jews had to pay a special tax that applied to the dhimmi population that the Muslims didn't have to pay. But if you paid your tax and you maintained a relatively quiet public life and didn't outrage the authorities, and you understood your position as a dhimmi, you could live for a long time happily and successfully. And it depended where you lived. Sometimes the Ottoman Empire was better. The Persian Empire sometimes was worse in terms of its persecution of Jews. But they lived there for centuries and generally very stably. It's really the modern period that sees a real growth in what today we would call Muslim anti-Semitism, and it's an infection from Europe. The term we use for anti-Semitism was developed in Germany by a journalist named Wilhelm Marr, M-A-H-R, and Marr coined this idea in 1881 to mark it as something different than anti-Judaism. He was not particularly religious, as most Enlightenment era people weren't in the 19th century. And so he wasn't basing his antipathy to Jews on religious ideas. He was basing it on who the Jews were and on the new science of racial identification. For all the attraction we find to Darwin's theory of evolution, it has a dark side. And the dark side is both social Darwinism, which we know about from sociology and economics, but also racial theories and the theory of dominant races and inferior races, the importance of bloodlines and genetic inheritance, and that old idea of the Jews as devil, the Jews as corruption, gets translated into this new racialized quasi-scientific vocabulary as the Jew as foreigner, foreign genetic and biological influence that needs to be either encapsulated, kept separate, or expelled, or, in its most extreme, eliminated. You see this in the language the Nazis would use. They talk about the Jews as vermin, as eradication. They use that phrase extermination, which is like what you use for, insects infestation. It's unfortunately part and process of that trend. There were a lot of reasons for this modern racialist anti-Semitism. I mentioned they were more secularized, and so the religious justification didn't work. We also have to remember that the 19th century in Europe is the period of the rise of ethnic nationalism. The German Empire comes together in the 19th century. The Italian kingdom comes together in the 19th century. You have Serbians and Ukrainians and Poles and all kinds of other groups who are advocating for their own nationalism based on the language they speak and on their religion and on their ethnic heritage. But in most cases, Jews are not included in that romantic, the folk, the people's ethnic identity. You can be German, or you can be a Jew in Germany. But the idea of being both Jewish and part of the German folk was seen as foreign, because part of that folkdom was either a religious identity or the historic culture or the mythology. This is also the rise of folklore. The Grimm brothers are publishing their material in the 19th century too. It's all part of this romantic movement of ethnic nationalism that leaves the Jews out. In Poland, again, you could be a Polish Jew and that you were a Jew who had lived in Poland for centuries, but you weren't Polish. You often didn't speak Polish. You spoke Yiddish. You didn't read Polish literature. You didn't identify as Polish. In the Polish interwar period between World War I and World War II, there were some Jews who Polonized, who became more active in Polish national culture, but a lot of Jews maintained separate identities, even voted for Jewish political parties in the Polish parliament as part of their ethnic representation. So the dislocations of modernity, Jews were very attracted to. They tended to live in cities, and so they were more modernized. They were set up for the capitalist economy because they weren't peasants living on farms. They had done business for centuries, and so they'd been sort of working with disabilities. And as the economies liberalized and removed Jewish restriction, they become more and more successful. And so then that leads to resentments against them, especially if they're running new industries and factories that the peasantry, which is flooding into the cities, is now suffering in. Or they're running the stock market, and there are stock market crashes, which happen periodically in the 19th century. Jews become easy scapegoats for that. Jews are promoting new culture, the Impressionist movement and art criticism, new radical political movements. Jews are seen as active in leadership roles in the Socialist Party and in communism. Well, now the Jews are a sign of what's wrong with modernity, where we want the old traditional values. That's that folkism, that sense of rootedness. And the Jews are the rootless. They're accused of being rootless cosmopolitans. They're not rooted in the soil like we are. They're part of the cosmopolis, the universal city that doesn't have authenticity, doesn't have roots, doesn't have loyalty, is only in it for a buck and to undermine what's traditional. Now, in a democratic system, you can have a political party that makes anti-Semitism its core. And while Adolf Hitler was a bum flopping around in flop houses and trying to sell his postcard art in Vienna, one of the major political figures was the mayor of Vienna named Karl Lueger, who was a rabid anti-Semite. And it was an asset to his political ambitions, even though Vienna itself was like a quarter Jewish at the time. But the people resented them, and so they voted for Lueger instead. It's around this time, at the turn of the 20th century, that you also see a book that appears, originally written by the Russian secret police in 1903. It's called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, are a statement of this global conspiracy theory that Jews are running everything bad. It claims to be the secret minutes of a meeting of this global Jewish conspiracy. And you can find it translated into all kinds of languages all over the world these days, because it does not die. It's like a zombie myth. So you can see just from the table of contents that I've put here on the document, what are the goals of the conspiracy? It's to take over the world, and to do so through violence and undermining what's maintaining civilization. So what do we do here? Step one, you have your basic doctrine principles. You can use economic wars, where there's a battle of economic interests. Materialism replaces religion. So now you've undermined the church as a guarantor of traditional values. And if people have no, transcendent values, they have no sense of self or self-worth, and they are at your mercy. You use worldwide wars, because you can pit the capitalist empires against each other in a way that undermines the strength of the countries. And of course, you can make money by selling weaponry to both sides. Re-education. Well, by changing what you're supposed to learn, you now have changed the core values of the society. And so you see, by the way, these battles even today over curricula, right? The question of who runs the curriculum, they get to decide the values. And are you undermining traditional values with this new curriculum idea that you're presenting? I mean, the antipathy towards new ways of teaching math, it doesn't make sense unless you see it through the lens of, by changing how you're teaching, you're changing the values of the culture. Controlling the press on protocol number 12, because whoever controls the press controls the messaging going out to the world. Assaulting religion, brainwashing, arresting your opponents, using the financial program of loans and credit, the power of gold. All of this is part of this global Jewish conspiracy. I mean, there's a suspicion of loans and credit dating back a long time. It was one of the reasons why Henry Ford was anti-Semitic. He didn't like people who made money from money. If you're going to make something and sell it, make it and sell it. So he didn't even start a Ford Motor Company credit department for a long time because he didn't want to be in the business of being a moneylender. That's Shylock. That's evil. That's the Jews grasping at money and not actually doing anything in the world. Well, so that was Ford's perspective, and it cost him money, but it was part of his worldview. Now, when we talk about the Nazi era, we understand this idea of a racialist anti-Semitism. You see the context, that it comes from this idea of the Jews as a satanic people that need to be separate. It comes from this ethnic nationalism that sees the Jews as not German. And so that's why one of the first Nuremberg laws passed in 1935, just 2 years after Hitler took over, bans marriages between Jews and subjects of the state and defines Jews as not being a subject of the state, of German blood. No extramarital relations are allowed. Jews cannot employ in their households female subjects of German blood under 45 years old, lest they pollute the gene pool, by mixing. They're not even allowed to fly the national flag, as if Jews would want to fly the Nazi flag, but that's a separate question. The goal is to separate the communities and to define Jewishness as a racial identity. And the stages of Nazi anti-Semitism went through initially excluding the Jews, keeping them separate from the Germans, to expelling the Jews, kicking them out of Germany, to executing the Jews, to wanting to kill them all. It didn't happen all at once. And what this raises for us is the dilemma of how to understand anti-Semitism. Because we use the same term to refer to a vast range of attitudes and behaviors. In France, thousands of Jews were saved. In Poland, there were thousands of Jews saved, but just because there were so many more Jews to start. There were a few 100,000 Jews in France when it was taken over by the Germans. There were 3 million Jews in Poland when it was taken over by the Germans. But we also have to remember that the attitudes toward the Jews were different in Poland and in France. And the punishment for helping Jews was different between between Poland and in France. In Poland, if you were caught hiding a Jew, you and your whole family would be killed instantly. If you were caught hiding a Jew in France, you'd go to prison. That's a very different context for wanting to help Jews, or being willing to, or able to help. In Hungary, the Jews were beset by a native Hungarian anti-Semitic party called it's not the Double Cross. It's I'm blanking now on the name of that party, but it was a native Hungarian party that was very anti-Semitic. Now, Bulgaria, which is right next door to Hungary, was very anti-Semitic also. But the Orthodox Church in Bulgaria protected the Jews, and the king refused to deport them. Some suspect it's because he had a Jewish mistress, maybe another Esther. But in this case, you couldn't necessarily predict who was going to go from not liking Jews to wanting to expel them or to kill them. Because sometimes the Bulgarian response was basically, they're our problem. We're not huge fans, but they're ours. And in France, there was a big difference if you were a Polish Jew or a French Jew. If you were a Polish Jewish refugee that wound up in France, you were much more likely to be deported. But if you'd grown up in France, you spoke French, you understood the values of liberté, égalité, fraternité, brotherhood, right? If you were part of that brotherhood, you were much more likely to be protected. So it really depended on context and circumstance. And even today, when we talk about anti-Semitism, it could be a bad joke. It could be an act of vandalism. It could be a nasty comment online. It could be personal physical assault. It could be attempted murder. We call all of those behaviors anti-Semitism. And so when they say anti-Semitism has risen 300% in the last 3 months, which it has based on reporting, that's counting all those categories together. So it's not that Jews getting assaulted has gone up 300%. That 300% includes nasty comments on Facebook. Now, nasty comments on Facebook are still nasty. They're not pleasant to receive, but they're not the same as vandalizing a cemetery or planting an explosive or throwing a firebomb at a Jewish school or assaulting people who look visibly Jewish on the street. Those have gone up too. But sometimes we have to be clear on what the circumstances are in terms of how best to respond. Now, if you heard about an anti-Semitic incident today, as I alluded to last night as well, it could come from any number of sources. It's not just the right-wing fascist Nazi who is reliving the glory days of the 1940s. Those do still exist. There are white supremacists out there, like the man who attacked the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue, who are anti-immigrant and anti-Jew because the Jews are bringing in the immigrants and polluting the blood. I mean, that language is still there. But you might also find people who are connected to the Arab world, who are anti-Israel and express their anti-Israel sentiments in attacking Jewish institutions or people and imbibing some of that negativity. There was a rumor going around for a time that Jews were stealing Palestinian organs from their prisoners, which is another version of that blood libel, right? Or they were giving poison candy to children because they want to kill Palestinian children. The emphasis on what's the casualties that are taking place in Gaza today, the emphasis on the civilian casualties, you have to ask, do you believe the Israeli story that it's collateral damage from Hamas hiding behind the civilians? Or the Palestinian sources don't claim any of them as fighters. All 26,000 who are dead are innocents, and they emphasize the death of children. And I found comments online connecting what's happening in Gaza to this idea that Jews just want to kill the enemy. They hate the world around them, and therefore they are evil in some way. You have on the progressive left people who are anti-Zionist, and some of them are, what I would call a principled anti-Zionist. They don't like the idea of ethnic states. And so they would also be opposed to a Kurdistan or to an Armenia that's focused on those identities. They wouldn't like a law of return to France or Germany, which do exist for people who ethnically connect with those cultures. So that they could be principled. Or they could be simply focused on Jews and Jews alone. And that begins to raise questions over what's the real motivation here. It could happen on social media, it could happen on college campuses. But you get people who are willing to say Jews are colonialists, and therefore the colonialist enterprise has to be destroyed at whatever cost, and therefore Jews can be killed for whatever reason in Israel. Well, that again crosses the line to my mind. You do get elements of the African-American community that have anti-Semitic attitudes. Some of this goes back to social dislocations and conflicts between Jewish landowners and shop owners and African-American communities starting in the 1960s and 70s. But it also extends to ideas of Black nationalism, blaming the Jews as white as part of the oppressor class, and this group called the Black Hebrews, who think that they are the true Israel, and the Jews are who are white are simply usurping and lying about Jewish history. We sometimes get comments from them on videos that we've done on Jewish history saying, you're all lying because you're all white. You're not really Jewish. That argument of who's the true Israel, doesn't that sound familiar? It's like the Christian supersessionism. It's the Muslim supersessionism. It's the claim we're the true revelation, the true Israel, and you are false. And because you're false and blind, you're evil. And then bad things happen. You do get people targeted for street crime simply because they're Jewish, and you do get loopy conspiracy theories that latch onto the Jews as a possible, even prominent source. And so, what do? Well, we can be aware of what's happening. We can understand the history. That's certainly very helpful. But we also have to respond appropriately. If it's a question of education, then educate. For example, over 50% of Israeli Jews are from the Middle East, from North Africa, and from Arab countries. They are not Europeans who came in to colonize. Not to mention the fact that there's a Jewish presence in the land going back over 2,000 years, long before Islam even started. So you can educate, and some people are willing to listen. You can advocate within the Jewish community, encourage people to stay strong, to identify, to join communities, to show up to events, to not let the outside world intimidate them. You can draw on positive connections that we have with the world around us. The second gentleman, the spouse of the vice president, is Jewish, and not just Jewish heritage, is actively Jewish, and has been involved in advocating for the situation of Jews dealing with this rise in anti-Semitism from the innermost halls of power. We are overrepresented in the Senate, in the House of Representatives. We have legal rights and a court system that recognizes it. We have plenty of lawyers that can work on our behalf within our community and beyond. So we are not powerless. It is not 1938. And we also have to remember that even if that number is 20%, not all of that 20% who agree with all those statements would vote for an anti-Semitic politician, would march an anti-Semitic protest, or would commit an anti-Semitic crime of vandalism or worse. Attitudes are not the same as actions. So the attitude level is a problem, and we have to work on it before it becomes action. But it's not time to panic and flee to Canada or Mexico or Australia. It is time to answer. And whether it's supporting organizations that work against anti-Semitism or track the incidents and respond, connecting with our local law enforcement that are willing to work with us on making us safer, taking reasonable, prudent steps to make ourselves safer and to avoid any of that potential violence. These are things that we're doing, and the Jewish community is doing more broadly. It's too bad that we have to spend our time and energy on that and not on creating a better Passover Haggadah or celebrating the high holidays in a more meaningful way. That would be great to spend energy on that instead. But we have to find a way to do both. You know, we've always in Jewish history both laughed and cried. And so if we are vigilant and jubilant, then that's the situation we are in today. So with that, I'd like to ask if you have any comments, questions, thoughts on that history of anti-Semitism or how it's playing out today.
I just had two thoughts when you started talking about the 19th century. My parents came from Germany, and when I visited my mother's home village, I luckily ran into some Hochschul teachers who spoke English and had written a history of the Jews in that town, and a genealogy of my mother's family. And one of the things that I didn't understand at that time was my mother's family originally came from a different village, and then they were allowed to go to her village. But then when they died, they had to send the corpse to the other village. They wouldn't allow to have a German a Jewish
Cemetery there.
Cemetery there until Napoleon. With Napoleon, the Jews became citizens of the empire, and they got last names. So I wonder whether the increase in anti-Semitism in the 19th century was because of the Jews becoming too close to the others, to the majority. And whether Reform Judaism, in part, was an attempt to become less different from the Germans, especially in urban areas. That one of the problems was we didn't look the same. We didn't necessarily dress the same.
So this is one of those perennial debates in Jewish life of how best to reduce anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
There are those who would argue we are too different. We need to be more like the people around us. And if they don't like us, it's because those Jews over there are too different, and I'm guilty by association. And so I'm going to be even more like them and even more like them. And I'm going to shave my beard and I'm going to serve in the army. And I'm going to only speak German. And I'm going to... Sometimes I'll convert, right? The response of the racialist anti-Semitism of the late 19th century said that was worse.
Mm.
Not that Jews are too different, but that Jews are insinuating themselves into German identity. They're, the stealth column that are sneaking their genetic detritus into our body politic and body biologic. And so this was a damned if you are and damned if you don't. The German Jews looked down on what they called the Ostjuden, the Polish Jews that had moved into Weimar Germany, but still maintained Orthodox practice and dress and so on. And they said, you're making us look bad. But a Zionist reading of Jewish history is they're going to hate us anyways, because look what happened to Alfred Dreyfus. He was a captain in the French army, not a private, not a lieutenant. He was a captain in the French army, very French. And they still hated him because he was a Jew. And he was a scapegoat because he was a Jew. And when he was taken out in disgrace and sent to Devil's Island, the crowd was yelling, "Bas les Juifs," down with the Jews. Not down with Dreyfus, the individual. Down with the Jews. So, Herzl's reading of that moment when he was a journalist watching it was, there's no winning.
Mm.
We become as nationalist, as patriotic, as much like everybody else as possible. They still hate us. So you'll notice, by the way, that you'll get both of these critiques of Judaism today. You're too separate, you're too nationalist, Israel is an ethno-nationalist state, which is a terrible thing, and Jews are too separatist and should be like everybody else. And you get the Jews are too liberal, Jews are undermining national borders, Jews are corrupting traditional values. There's the good Jews and the bad Jews. And right-wing people have their good Jews are the Orthodox ones, the religious ones, the traditionalist ones. For left-wing people, those are the bad Jews. They're too religious, they're too nationalist, they're too separatist. But the good Jews on the far left side are the ones who are anti-Zionist and whose Jewishness is, if not thin, it's religious and not ethnic. It's a very different kind of Judaism than what many people have experienced. So we get it from both sides. We're set up in a position that we can get it from both ways. And you're right that Napoleon emancipating the Jews and sort of the Enlightenment project in general, emancipating the Jews, might have solved the problem if they had been allowed in some terms. And the Reform movement hoped they would get in as Frenchmen of the Jewish faith. Mm-hmm. If they could make Judaism just religion, you could be a German of the Mosaic faith, and you'd be fully German, and you just happen to be a different religion, just like the Protestants and the Catholics, and we're just as German as everybody else. But Jewishness has always had an ethnic component to it, both within the Jewish community and certainly from an outside perspective. And so they came up with a new reason to hate Jews in the racialist anti-Semitism of the late 19th century, where the being different didn't work anymore, but they still didn't like Jews. And so how do they justify that?
So they would like us less if we called ourselves Jewish Germans than if we called ourselves German Jews.
Well, some would like you fine, and some wouldn't like you. But the ones who wouldn't like you no matter what you did.
That's the point. Good point.
Susie or Rami, did you have anything you wanted to?
Yeah, I have a comment. Our species, individuals and collectively, we're very successful in some ways, but we're never totally successful. There's always tensions and failures, and going back to last night's commentary, that the Jews are attacked more, are subject to more anti-Semitism when conditions are worse. And bad conditions are always there. So the species needs a scapegoat. And probably for historical reasons, the Jews have become a scapegoat for much of the population that we deal with. And that's why no matter which way you go, no matter what choices you make, somebody's going to find fault because they need the scapegoat. And, in a way, I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I don't know what the solution is anyway. In a way, maybe it's try to have the rising tide that lifts all boats, so there is less failure and less impetus to scapegoat anyone. It's the different minority groups being pitted against each other by a dominant civilization that's also very, very much a part of the story. I heard a statement once that the Black experience in the United States is most mainstream when they're hating Jews. And yet we know that the Black-Jewish alliance has been very important as well. But my main point, I think,
And there are Black Jews.
well, yes,
Yes.
and that's another expression. But I think it was Sartre who made the point that if Jews didn't exist, they'd have to be invented, because you need an other, you need a target.
Right.
And here's this population that insists upon staying identifiable and staying cohesive, and they become a great target.
Yep. Yep.
Adam, I just have a quick question. I mean, I have a lot I could say, but what was going on in '64 that the anti-Semitism was so high? I mean, I know where I was at: sex, drugs, rock and roll. I wasn't paying too much attention to anti-Semitism. The free spirit that I was.
Well, and remember that's actually on the downward slope. That's when the first year the ADL did the survey. But if you went back to the 1930s and 40s, you had Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest based in Detroit, who railed against Jewish communists and just Jews in general. He was, again, one of those people who blamed the Jews for capitalism and their exploitation of the workers, and Jews for communism and their undermining of religious values and national traditions. Henry Ford was publishing the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his Dearborn Independent newspaper, which he required all of his car dealers to distribute. So it got a very broad distribution.
Right. Lindbergh
in the 1940 had that famous speech where he railed against Jewish influence, drawing America into war. And he's the one who came up with the idea of America first.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, if you went from the 40s to the 60s, 29% would have been, a real downward slope. But remember, large parts of America were not New York City or Boston. And at the time, something like, I think in the early 60s, something like 80% of American Jews lived in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Right? We were not as dispersed as we are now. So most Americans had never met a Jew, and hadn't, they'd seen Jewish comedians and actors, the people on television, but this is the era where, everyone changed their name.
Mm-hmm.
Edward G. Robinson was only successful because he wasn't Edward Goldberg.
Mm.
The G was for Goldberg.
Yeah.
And so on. I mean, there's a huge list of Hollywood stars that changed their names because it wouldn't play in Peoria, as they say.
Yeah.
So, that era was one of Jewish exclusion. There were still neighborhoods that wouldn't sell to Jews. Realtors would direct them to certain communities. Universities still had exclusive admission in some cases. The restrictive covenant on real estate sales was legally barred in the late 1940s, I think. But it takes a long time for attitudes to shift. But the other thing that happened beginning in the 60s that saw that decline is that Jews began to be accepted as white.
Right.
Uh-huh.
After
Mm-hmm.
before
World
then
War
they were
II.
excluded as something other, just like the Irish and Italians were sometimes excluded in similar ways by the white Protestant establishment. Jews were, you could have swimming pools that no dogs or Jews, and certainly no black people. But beginning in the 60s, the Jews begin to be assimilated as white. First of all, they were eligible for the GI Bill and were able to go to college. They began moving out to these new suburbs that were mixed identity, not just Jewish ghettos where they were only living with other Jews. They began to assimilate in language because the immigration experience more or less stopped for most Jews in the 1920s. So by the 1960s, the next generation was growing up fully fluent in American language and culture. And so they weren't as different as they had been in the 20s and 30s. And so
Now,
that helped to lead the decline following 60.
now that you say that, I'm reminded that when I was in college, I was rejected from sorority membership because they had a quota of 2 per sorority or something like that.
Mm.
That kind of thing. And also, I think somebody mentioned about the horn. Somebody asked me about that. And so that was still, that was in the 1964, 65.
Yeah. So in that era, that was still more known. And,
Mhm.
so it was definitely progress through the middle of the 20th century. And now we're seeing a bit of a backslide to that. I don't think people are going to start checking for horns again.
Yeah,
That may not make a rebirth. But definitely this position of people assuming things about Jews or having negative feelings towards them are going to be there.
Yeah.
But I go back to that survey that the ADL launched, and I know Jews and I know public Jews who sound more loyal to Israel than they are to the United States, who vote in American elections based on what they think is good for Israel,
Yeah.
not on what they think is good for America. You know them too, I'm sure, or have seen them or read their op-eds. And, so is that inherently anti-Semitic to think that some Jews are more loyal to Israel than America? I think it's fact. And if you see enough of those figures, you're going to start to think that's a universal Jewish phenomenon and not just those specific people, especially if you don't know very many Jews. And there's still plenty of Americans who don't know very many Jews.
Right.
So it's sort of like the progress in the LGBTQ world. The more real Jews you know, the less anti-Semitic you'll be. And so maybe part of our role is to get out there and to make sure people know that we are Jewish and that we don't fit their stereotype, that all Jews are Orthodox, Zionist, rabid Netanyahu supporters. It's so amazing to me that people assume that Jews are all one thing. 80% of Jews don't keep kosher. And people think, well, Jews don't eat ham, right? Most of us do. If we eat meat at all. Some of us are vegetarian. But it's getting through those stereotypes and the misimpressions that will help in the long run.
Yeah. I think I told you, maybe I didn't, Adam, the time that I met a woman from Las Vegas. She was a hairdresser. And she said to me that it was a spiritual retreat, by the way. And she said to me, I have only one regret in life. And that was that Hitler didn't get the job done, especially with New York Jew bitches like you.
Oh my God.
And that's
Right.
at a spiritual retreat.
And that was at a
Yeah.
spiritual retreat.
Seems like she
Right.
had
And
some
I
things
was
to
just
work
like,
on.
what?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's out there. That's
That
out
was
there.
like 23 years ago, 24 years ago.
Hmm.
And she's probably still around.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
You have to remember, America has a lot of negativity in it. Those teenagers that were screaming at the black students desegregating schools in the 1950s, they're in their 70s or 80s.
Right.
They're
Right.
still around.
Right. That's like the German American Bund when it disintegrated. Everybody just became whatever they were in society.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so there's some of them still out there too.
And it is taught generation to generation.
Yeah.
It
Right.
takes effort for someone to step back from their own history sometimes.
I mean, there are positive trends. College education is correlated to a decline in anti-Semitic attitudes, and more people are getting some version of a college education. So that has a positive impact. I mean, intermarriage rates are still really, really high, which means that more Jews are part of more families. And so, again, a real life person who's Jewish, who married into your family, who's actually a really nice person, and ideally, and and that can create positive feelings that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So there are causes for optimism. It's just we're in a place where it's hard to be optimistic because of the negativity and the reality of what's happening out there. We will have to see if the ceasefire arrangement that seems like they're negotiating goes through, inshallah, God willing, as they say.
Right.
Then maybe we'll see somewhat of a decline
Yeah.
as current tensions fade. We'll see.
Or at least quiet down for a time.
Or dispel for a time until the next one.
Right.